So plants, of course, very distinct kinds of organisms. And if we build them from the ground up, we're going to be looking at their cells that make them distinct. And this is kind of a little more typical plant cell involved in photosynthesis. So these are plant cells that you might have seen something like this before. This is showing, of course, that green coloration that we talked about in photosynthesis, present in eukaryotic cells inside of their chloroplasts. And also, maybe you can tell there's kind of a more of a rigid cell wall on these cells. So a couple of big features you can just kind of tell immediately from noticing you've got a plant cell. Plant cells are often contrasted with animal cells. If you learn in introductory biology about what makes up a cell, this is the kind of diagram you might have seen there. And often plant cells and animal cells are described with an emphasis on what makes them different, right? So they have lots in common. They're both eukaryotes. So plants, animals, also fungi would have lots of these common eukaryotic features. So we have in purple here the nucleus, where majority of the DNA is contained. That's that squiggly stuff on the inside. So nucleus with DNA, organelles associated with the nucleus, and so on. A lot of the organelles you probably encountered in your descriptions of eukaryotic cells, those are in common between animals and plant cells. And the major differences, you can probably recall these. Plant cells have cell wall. We'll talk about that, what it is and how it's made. Animal cells, not so much. And we'll kind of skip the fungi for now. We will talk about what their cells look like a little bit later. So presence of a cell wall, presence of a vacuole. This is sort of an internal water reservoir. It's not entirely water, and it can be helpful for some plant-specific functions. And then we already talked about the chloroplasts here. So chloroplast, vacuole, cell wall, those are distinct to plant cells and important to their distinctive function that makes them different from animal cells. So zooming in on the chloroplast, very interesting structure with a very interesting history. So this is really the single place where photosynthesis happens. So they're green, as we saw in the previous image, and the green is due to the chlorophyll. And they also have other enzymes and structures, such as this membrane that's folded all over itself. Those structures enable photosynthesis to happen. So it's not just a matter of having chlorophyll and being green. That doesn't instantly get you the ability to do photosynthesis, but you need the kind of the whole structure to work together to make that happen. So in eukaryotes that do photosynthesis, this is an indispensable organelle. All right, so emphasis again on the membranes as we talked in the photosynthesis lecture. So you probably learned them as chloroplasts, and there's kind of a trend. I actually don't know if this trend is going to hold up over time, but the current trend is to refer to what we usually call as the chloroplast. It often gets referred to as plastid. And the reason for that is that chloroplast, in the name chloroplast, the chloro part means that it's green. And the organelle can kind of be the same organelle, but not always green. So there's an image here that shows a pepper, a red pepper that is ripened. And it does an interesting thing where the chloroplasts, so as if you've got a red pepper to start with, as that pepper gets older and more mature, more ripe, it starts as a green pepper and it matures and ripens into red. So the greenness actually changes over to the redness. And the same location where the green was before inside of the chloroplasts becomes red. So these chloroplasts aren't green anymore. They don't really get called chloroplasts. They're not doing photosynthesis. They've shifted function to hold on to pigments. So we call them chromoplasts. So basically there's this transition here where the chloroplast became a chromoplast. And so that's why this plastid term is a little more universal. It's the same thing, but it can change from green to other functions. So photosynthesis enabled by the chloroplast, pigment containing organelles become the chromoplasts, and the plastid also can be modified, as you see with these arrows. They're basically arrows going back and forth between all kinds of these transitions. They can be modified to store starch as an amyloplast, to basically kind of be dormant and non-functional for photosynthesis as this idioplast, elioplast as a lipid storing organelle. So it's a multifunctional organelle And we'll kind of see how it's a lot more independent than some of your organelles for some reasons. So just the transition between these forms, there are not always cells that are needing to do photosynthesis. They might have other functions, such as we see here in the ripening fruit. And then also, one thing I like to remind people is that if you look at a, say, underground part of a plant, roots have plastids, but they're not green. It doesn't serve the plant to have green roots underground. So those cells still have their plastids. In some plants, root cells can give rise to new stem tissue. And so the chloroplasts or the plastids are still in there, but then they have to become green to do photosynthesis. So in roots, you might see them more as one of these like etioplasts, or maybe a nutrient storage structure is one of these other ones. So more versatility in one specific kind of organelle. Another one, this is kind of a recent, relatively recent development, was discovering that the chloroplast also can transition into what's sometimes called the tannosome. So tannosome, the tanno part of that refers to tannins. Let me describe the tannin for a second here. Let me just write it out for you here. The term is tannins. Tannin. And it's a kind of molecule that is used by plants, makes them bitter to us. And so this is one of the reasons why you can't eat a lot of the fruits or nuts that you find in the world. So acorns are rich in tannins. If you try eating an acorn, it makes your cheeks pucker up a whole bunch. Tannins are present in unripe bananas. Personally, I'm not too fond of unripe bananas. They have that kind of, it's almost like a fuzzy feel in your mouth. And so that's a deterrent to somebody eating a plant. And a couple of commercially important versions are tea is rich in tannins, so kind of the astringent kind of taste of tea. Same thing, grape juice or wine in the skin of grapes, they have tannins. And so to some extent, we make use of these as flavors that people enjoy, but they end up also having this coloration to them. So kind of a tea color to the water. Those are the tannins leaching out of the leaves into the water. And so this study found out that basically tannins can be concentrated into these organelles that used to be chloroplasts. So I guess this is maybe a one-way transition from what used to be a chloroplast. All right, so the vacuole, another important part of plant structure. The vacuole, I think it's easy to kind of discount it as not too important. It just looks, if you see an image of a plant cell with a vacuole, just kind of looks like an open watery space. And that's kind of its function in a lot of ways. One of the reasons that the vacuole is there is that plants need to have water available. So individual cells hold on to this water reservoir, and you probably experienced this with your house plants. So this is a house plant that's wilting, seen much better days. And as a plant wilts, it loses its rigidity. So because of the vacuole, plant cells are a little bit more like balloons, and they're filled up with this water. And as the water runs out, if the whole plant is running out of water, those get weaker and smaller and limp, and the plant starts kind of collapsing on itself. So that happens if the soil is dry and there's no water to be pulled up from the soil. In nature, this might happen during a drought or just in between rains. Depending on the plant, they should be adapted to the local rain schedule of when rain usually happens in the place where they grow. But sometimes there's just drier than usual conditions and plants will wilt like this. And so this plant would have been drawing from its vacuole water reserves up to a point, and now it's really low on water reserves. If this plant is at your house, please give it some water. So I guess kind of the flip side of that is that once this plant gets its water back, a lot of plants can bounce back pretty well after wilting. If you get them water again, they just sort of reinflate their vacuole and they get back up to rigid and back to healthy. So it's sort of a nice reservoir of emergency backup water for situations like this. Other things the vacuole can do, on the right hand here, we've got an image of some cells in a leaf. And this pink part here is showing a water-soluble pigment known as an anthocyanin. And this one's actually a pigment that's put into the vacuole. So vacuole can have a couple functions at the same time. It can store water and also hold some pigments. Kind of interesting, we'll see this in one of the labs later in the semester, but this little bits of pink scattered through the cells, this gives an overall pink or purple appearance to the leaf, even though on a microscopic level, you can see there's not evenly distributed pigment throughout. And then one other, when it comes to the stomata, these pores that let gas in and out of the plant, there are these cells called guard cells on the sides of the stoma or stomata, 2 at a time. And as they're filled with, when they become more rigid, filled with extra water, they kind of push against each other and end up opening this space between them. And the plant can control whether they have filled vacuoles or drained vacuoles by affecting the amount of potassium ions. So this K+ or potassium ions, through principles of osmosis, they can put the potassium into the vacuole that draws water in, causes the cells to become big and push against each other. If the water goes out, the potassium is out of the vacuole, the water goes out of the vacuole and they deflate, and their kind of fail-safe position is to collapse. So this is also handy if the plant is low on water in general. The guard cells will also deflate and close the stomata. So stomata can be a place where plants lose water from. So when they're low on water, they just kind of revert or fall back on this safer arrangement of having their guard cells close up the vacuole. So specifically the stomata, I think they're just the cutest little things. The term stoma, you might have seen it in an animal context, comes from the Greek for mouth. So a stoma is a mouth, stomata is plural. And as we saw previously in the last slide, there are 2 cells against each other. These are called the guard cells, and give them a very, very distinct look. If you're looking at the surface of a leaf, we might be able to look at some of these in lab. And these are there to allow gas to come into the plant or leave the plant. So think for a second about what plants need as far as gas from the atmosphere. They need carbon dioxide to make sugars during photosynthesis. They need to release oxygen to the atmosphere. Plants also need to take in oxygen if they're doing any cellular respiration. So this allows them to pull in gases from the atmosphere, but it's also a little bit of a liability because water can escape, water vapor can escape as these pores are open. So having the ability to open and close them lets the plant regulate when it's drawing in gases, when it's risking losing water, and so on. All right, so another feature of plant cells, the cell wall. The cell wall exists outside of the cell membrane. So the cell membrane or the plasma membrane is shown here. And the cell wall is outside of that. So down below this image would be the inside of the cell. And outside of that are strands of cellulose. So the cell wall is primarily made up of cellulose. These are these big cylinders, these cable-looking cylinders. And those are most of it. And there are these other molecules called pectin and hemicellulose that help to hold the cellulose strands in place. So it's stiff, but it's not 100% immovable. So these can expand and contract a little bit. Plants can control how stiff their cell walls are, again, depending on what they need from the environment. So a little more detail on cellulose. Cellulose is kind of an amazing molecule. So this is one of the big success stories of plants. There also is cellulose in some of the green algae and other eukaryotes. So not distinct, not unique to land plants. Good for providing stiffness and also a barrier to anything that might want to chew through the cells or dissolve its way into the cells. And interestingly, cellulose, I mentioned it's these big cables. So a big cable here labeled as a microfibril. Those are made up of smaller strands, and the individual strands are basically modified chains of glucose molecules. It's just glucose, 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 glucose. So glucose was our big output molecule from photosynthesis. This is kind of the generalized sugar of life, as you cover in photosynthesis and cellular respiration. And plants have the ability to string these together and turn them into a molecule that is much harder to digest. So really interesting to me, glucose is this like universal, everybody can digest it molecule. But if you make glucose into cellulose, cellulose is really hard to digest. So it's kind of locked up to enzymes that would otherwise digest sugars, makes it very durable. We'll see what cellulose actually is in some of the products you might be familiar with. But it's just linked together in these strands, and the strands are wrapped around the cells to make up the cell wall. So here's a little bit more detail about what cellulose is. I'd expect a lot of you are wearing mostly cellulose right now. Most of my clothing is made up of cellulose in the form of cotton. So cotton is a plant that has big fibrous strands around its seeds. Inside of the cotton boll, this capsule, is there's some seeds in there, but also a whole lot of this strandy stuff. People have cultivated cotton, so we probably get a lot more strands out than the natural version might have had. And of course, getting the seeds out of there is an important part of the process. So you can get cellulose and turn it into clothing from cotton. That's our primary source for clothing. Although I've seen you can get clothing made out of other cellulose sources. So the benefit of cotton is it's long strands that can be kind of organized together. Probably up in here, this upper right image is more what you would see at really high magnification of fabric that you might wear. Other features that you can use cellulose for, it can be pressed flat into paper. This is an electron micrograph of what paper looks like. So it's strands of cellulose, but a lot more just mashed together. So it makes up paper of varying thicknesses, so a thick kind of parchment type of paper, all the way into a rather thin and easily broken apart toilet paper. So thank you, cellulose. Can you imagine what we'd have if we didn't have clothing and toilet paper? Whew, oh buddy. Another interesting feature is that the sponges you're probably using in your everyday life, we call them sponges because they, well, I mean, the word is overlapping between this and the organism known as a sponge, which is a marine animal. But this is actually the cellulose sponges that you're probably using in your kitchen, the ones that are more commercially available, cheaper. These are artificially made. So these are also made up of cellulose, and they're produced by kind of foaming up a cellulose mixture and allowing it to set, and gives it the sponginess that we like in our sponges. But also, we kind of glossed over a little bit the chemical properties of cellulose. So let's go back a little bit here. These little dots on here indicating some potential for hydrogen bonds, and hydrogen bonds make molecules kind of sticky for each other, and it makes them also sticky for water. So this is a hydrophilic kind of molecule, and so cellulose in the cell wall can hold on to water. If you think about these things, if you get water on your clothing or water on your notebook, it soaks right in. So cellulose pretty good at absorbing water, and that's what makes it great for these sponges in your kitchen, just taking advantage of the chemical properties of cellulose to absorb water. All right, so from the cell's perspective, to make cellulose, I mentioned the cellulose is on the outside of the cell. So the cellulose, the organic part, the living part of the cell, is really inside of the cell membrane. So this is the phospholipid bilayer that makes up the cell membrane. And here it has outside of cell. The pinkish color here is the inside of the cell. And the molecules that are making the cellulose are these membrane-associated CESA, the cellulose synthase complex. And these are organized into these six-parted little rosettes. You can kind of see them under electron micrograph here. And they can move around. So they're sort of synthesizing little factories. they take glucose from the inside of the cell and they turn it into the cellulose strands toward the outside of the cell. And through the action of microtubules, on the cytoskeleton on the inside of the cell, they can be guided around and kind of moved around so that the strands of cellulose wrap the cell in a precise fashion. So it's far from accidental how these cells get wrapped up with cellulose. Let me try to draw one here. So imagine we got a cell that's more of a rectangle. If you got these cellulose synthesizing complexes here, they can be kind of driven by the locations of the cytoskeleton, and they end up kind of wrapping around and around. I'm drawing just from one side of this, but they can wrap in one direction, they can wrap in another direction, and depending on how much, like how many layers of cellulose are wrapped, what directions they wrap in, they can really firm up that cell from the outside. And it always reminds me of this one from Star Wars, carefully wrapping up something. All right. So another feature I mentioned, cellulose is a durable molecule. Glucose is easily broken down by just about, as far as I know, everything that's alive can easily break down glucose. It's an important part of metabolism. But cellulose is far from easy to break down. So it's very durable. We cannot eat cellulose. I mean, we can eat it, we just can't digest it into anything useful, which is interesting because it's made up of sugar. So it's this tough plant stuff that has sugar and plenty of energy put into it, but our bodies can't turn it into energy. So when people eat cellulose, that's what we call dietary fiber. So if you ever see dietary fiber on your ingredients list, that's basically what they're talking about, is plant parts, plant cell wall. Sometimes those are kind of accidental. When you eat fruit, you get cell walls along with the fruit of your apple. If you're eating grains or something like that, there's quite a bit of cell wall contained in that. So if you're eating whole fruits or whole plant parts, they're going to come with plant cell walls in addition to the plant cell innards that you're actually using for your nutrients. And dietary fiber is, when I was a kid, it was one of the hot things to eat as far as weight control or dietary control, because it fills you up. You can eat a lot of fiber and feel full, and your body can't do a dang thing about it. So you don't get extra calories from eating fiber, but you can feel full from it. That's one of the advantages, if you want to see it that way. Another advantage is you might have seen your fiber commercials if you're watching television at a certain hour. They have commercials for fiber that you can put into drinks and drink it. This is for keeping people regular, helping them to poop on a regular schedule. And fiber in your digestive tract allows your body to absorb more water into the digestive tract and keep the system moving along. So that also has to do with that water absorbing property of fiber. So you can eat this and it makes you less dry on the inside. Now also on this image, I've got a lot of animals that can digest cellulose. So we cannot, but these animals known as ruminants, here's an elk, they can eat plenty of grass and things that are very thick in fibers. And they actually turn that into energy. So ruminant animals, koalas are kind of notorious for having a specialized ability to digest cellulose. Termites, of course, animals that eat plants, like the tougher plant parts, wood and stuff, they can digest the cellulose that they encounter. And the trick is that they're not doing it on their own. So it's not really an animal ability. It's an ability that these animals have partnered with bacteria to do. So they have bacteria in their gut that help them break down the cellulose, and the bacteria get some energy, and the host animal also gets some energy as a result of this. So just some illustrations of, here's a termite on the right with a rather large hind gut where this bacterial, basically like a fermentation process happens. And then these other ones just illustrating, I guess if you compare the llama here to the other animals, the llama is a ruminant animal. and it's got a big digestive system, so a much larger kind of stomach system. Cows, you might be familiar with, have chambered stomachs where they can do this fermentation with the help of bacteria as they eat their grass food or hay or whatever they're eating. That's helping them to draw nutrients out of it. So if you went and ate a meal full of hay or grass, your body couldn't really make anything good out of it. But if you were a llama, different story. All right, let me